Chapter 1. Friday, December 20th. The trial was irretrievably over. Everything that could be said had been said, but he had never doubted that he would lose. The written verdict was handed down at 10:00 on Friday morning, and all that remained was a summing up from the reporters waiting in the corridor outside the district court. Carl! Mikael Blomqvist saw them through the doorway and slowed his step. He had no wish to discuss the verdict, but questions were unavoidable, and he, of all people, knew that they had to be asked and answered. This is how it is to be a criminal, he thought. On the other side of the microphone, he straightened up and tried to smile. The reporters gave him friendly, almost embarrassed greetings. Let's see. Aftonbladet, Expressen, TT Wire Service, TV4, and where are you from? Ah, yes, Dagens Nyheter. I must be a celebrity, Blomqvist said. Give us a soundbite, Kalle Blomqvist. It was a reporter from one of the evening papers. Blomqvist, hearing the nickname, forced himself as always not to roll his eyes. Once, when he was 23 and had just started his first summer job as a journalist, Blomqvist had chanced upon a gang which had pulled off 5 bank robberies over the past 2 years. There was no doubt that it was the same gang in every instance. Their trademark was to hold up 2 banks at a time with military precision. They wore masks from Disney World, so inevitably, police logic dubbed them the Donald Duck Gang. The newspapers renamed them the Bear Gang, which sounded more sinister, more appropriate to the fact that on 2 occasions, they had recklessly fired warning shots and threatened curious passers-by. Their 6th outing was at a bank in Östergötland at the height of the holiday season. A reporter from the local radio station happened to be in the bank at the time. As soon as the robbers were gone, he went to a public telephone and dictated his story for live broadcast. Blomqvist was spending several days with a girlfriend at her parents' summer cabin near Katrineholm. Exactly why he made the connection, he could not explain, even to the police. But as he was listening to the news report, he remembered a group of 4 men in a summer cabin a few hundred feet down the road. He had seen them playing badminton out in the yard. 4 blonde, athletic types in shorts with their shirts off. They were obviously bodybuilders, and there had been something about them that had made him look twice. Maybe it was because the game was being played in blazing sunshine with what he recognized as intensely focused energy. There had been no good reason to suspect them of being the bank robbers, but nevertheless, he had gone to a hill overlooking their cabin. It seemed empty. It was about 40 minutes before a Volvo drove up and parked in the yard. The young men got out in a hurry and were each carrying a sports bag, so they might have been doing nothing more than coming back from a swim. But one of them returned to the car and took out from the boot something which he hurriedly covered with his jacket. Even from Blomqvist's relatively distant observation post, he could tell that it was a good old AK-4, the rifle that had been his constant companion for the year of his military service. He called the police, and that was the start of a 3-day siege of the cabin, blanket coverage by the media, with Blomqvist in a front row seat and collecting a gratifyingly large fee from an evening paper. The police set up their headquarters in a caravan in the garden of the cabin where Blomqvist was staying. The fall of the Bear Gang gave him the star billing that launched him as a young journalist. The downside of his celebrity was that the other evening newspaper could not resist using the headline, Kalle Blomqvist solves the case. The tongue-in-cheek story was written by an older female columnist and contained references to the young detective in Astrid Lindgren's books for children. To make matters worse, the paper had run the story with a grainy photograph of Blomqvist, with his mouth half open, even as he raised an index finger to point. It made no difference that Blomqvist had never in life used the name Carl. From that moment on, to his dismay, he was nicknamed Kalle Blomqvist by his peers, an epithet employed with taunting provocation, not unfriendly but not really friendly either. In spite of his respect for Astrid Lindgren, whose books he loved, he detested the nickname. It took him several years and far weightier journalistic successes before the nickname began to fade, but he still cringed if ever the name was used in his hearing. Right now, he achieved a placid smile and said to the reporter from the evening paper, "Oh, come on, think of something yourself. You usually do." His tone was not unpleasant. They all knew each other more or less, and Blomqvist's most vicious critics had not come that morning. One of the journalists there had at one time worked with him, and at a party some years ago, he had nearly succeeded in picking up one of the reporters. the woman from She on TV4. You took a real hit in there today, said the one from Dagens Nyheter, clearly a young part-timer. How does it feel? Despite the seriousness of the situation, neither Blomqvist nor the older journalist could help smiling. He exchanged glances with TV4. How does it feel? The half-witted sports reporter shoves his microphone in the face of the breathless athlete on the finishing line. I can only regret that the court did not come to a different conclusion, he said a bit stuffily. 3 months in jail and 150,000 kroner damages. That's pretty severe, said She from TV4. I'll survive. Are you going to apologize to Wennerström? Shake his hand? I think not. So you still would say that he's a crook? Dagens Nyheter. The court had just ruled that Blomqvist had libeled and defamed the financier Hans-Erik Wennerström. The trial was over and he had no plans to appeal. So what would happen if he repeated his claim on the courthouse steps? Blomqvist decided that he did not want to find out. I thought I had good reason to publish the information that was in my possession. The court has ruled otherwise, and I must accept that the judicial process has taken its course. Those of us on the editorial staff will have to discuss the judgment before we decide what we're going to do. I have no more to add. But how did you come to forget that journalists actually have to back up their assertions? She from TV4. Her expression was neutral, but Blomqvist thought he saw a hint of disappointed repudiation in her eyes. The reporters on site, apart from the boy from Dagens Nyheter, were all veterans in the business. For them, the answer to that question was beyond the conceivable. I have nothing to add, he repeated. But when the others had accepted this, TV4 stood him against the doors to the courthouse and asked her questions in front of the camera. She was kinder than he deserved, and there were enough clear answers to satisfy all the reporters still standing behind her. The story would be in the headlines, but he reminded himself that they were not dealing with the media event of the year here. The reporters had what they needed and headed back to their respective newsrooms. He considered walking, but it was a blustery December day, and he was already cold after the interview. As he walked down the courtroom steps, he saw William Borg getting out of his car. He must have been sitting there during the interview. Their eyes met, and then Borg smiled. It was worth coming down here just to see you with that paper in your hand. Blomqvist said nothing. Borg and Blomqvist had known each other for 15 years. They had worked together as cub reporters for the financial section of a morning paper. Maybe it was a question of chemistry, but the foundation had been laid there for a lifelong enmity. In Blomqvist's eyes, Borg had been a third-rate reporter and a troublesome person who annoyed everyone around him with crass jokes and made disparaging remarks about the more experienced, older reporters. He seemed to dislike the older female reporters in particular. They had their first quarrel, then others, and anon the antagonism turned personal. Over the years, they had run into each other regularly, but it was not until the late 90s that they became serious enemies. Blomqvist had published a book about financial journalism and quoted extensively a number of idiotic articles written by Borg. Borg came across as a pompous ass who got many of his facts upside down and wrote homages to dot-com companies that were on the brink of going under. When thereafter they met by chance in a bar in Söder, they had all but come to blows. Borg left journalism, and now he worked in PR, for a considerably higher salary, at a firm that, to make things worse, was part of industrialist Hans-Erik Wennerström's sphere of influence. They looked at each other for a long moment before Blomqvist turned on his heel and walked away. It was typical of Borg to drive to the courthouse simply to sit there and laugh at him. The number 40 bus braked to a stop in front of Borg's car, and Blomqvist hopped on to make his escape. He got off at Fridhemsplan, undecided what to do. He was still holding the judgment document in his hand. Finally, he walked over to Cafe Anna, next to the garage entrance leading underneath the police station. Half a minute after he had ordered a cafe latte and a sandwich, the lunchtime news came on the radio. The story followed that of a suicide bombing in Jerusalem, and the news that the government had appointed a commission to investigate the alleged formation of a new cartel within the construction industry. Journalist Michael Blomqvist of the magazine Millennium was sentenced this morning to 90 days in jail for aggravated libel of industrialist Hans-Erik Wennerström. In an article earlier this year that drew attention to the so-called Minos affair, Blomqvist claimed that Wennerström had used state funds intended for industrial investment in Poland for arms deals. Blomqvist was also sentenced to pay 150,000 SEK in damages. In a statement, Wennerström's lawyer, Bertil Kamnermarker, said that his client was satisfied with the judgment. It was an exceptionally outrageous case of libel, he said. The judgment was 26 pages long. It set out the reasons for finding Blomqvist guilty on 15 counts of aggravated libel of the businessman Hans-Erik Wennerström. So each count cost him 10,000 kroner and 6 days in jail. And then there were the court costs and his own lawyer's fee. He could not bring himself to think about all the expenses, but he calculated too that it might have been worse. The court had acquitted him on 7 other counts. As he read the judgment, he felt a growing heaviness and discomfort in his stomach. This surprised him. As the trial began, he knew that it would take a miracle for him to escape conviction, and he had become reconciled to the outcome. He sat through the 2 days of the trial surprisingly calm, and for 11 more days he waited, without feeling anything in particular, for the court to finish deliberating and to come up with the document he now held in his hand. It was only now that a physical unease washed over him. When he took a bite of his sandwich, the bread seemed to swell up in his mouth. He could hardly swallow it and pushed his plate aside. This was the first time that Blomqvist had faced any charge. The judgment was a trifle, relatively speaking. A lightweight crime. Not armed robbery, murder, or rape, after all. From a financial point of view, however, it was serious. Millennium was not a flagship of the media world with unlimited resources. The magazine barely broke even. But the judgment did not spell catastrophe. The problem was that Blomqvist was one of Millennium's part owners, and at the same time, idiotically enough, he was both a writer and the magazine's publisher. The damages of 150,000 kroner he would pay himself, although that would just about wipe out his savings. The magazine would take care of the court costs. With prudent budgeting, it would work out. He pondered the wisdom of selling his apartment, though it would break his heart. At the end of the go-go 80s, during a period when he had a steady job and a pretty good salary, he had looked around for a permanent place to live. He ran from one apartment showing to another before he stumbled on an attic flat of 700 square feet right at the end of Bellmansgatan. The previous owner was in the middle of making it livable, but suddenly got a job at a .com company abroad, and Blomqvist was able to buy it inexpensively. He rejected the original interior designer sketches and finished the work himself. He put money into fixing up the bathroom and the kitchen area, but instead of putting in a parquet floor and interior walls to make it into the planned 2-room apartment, he sanded the floorboards, whitewashed the rough walls, and hid the worst patches behind 2 watercolors by Emanuel Bernstone. The result was an open living space, with the bedroom area behind a bookshelf, in the dining area in the living room, next to the small kitchen behind a counter. The apartment had 2 dormer windows and a gable window, with a view of the rooftops towards Gamla Stan, Stockholm's oldest section, and the water of Riddarfjorden. He had a glimpse of water by the Slussen locks and a view of City Hall. Today, he would never be able to afford such an apartment, and he badly wanted to hold on to it. But that he might lose the apartment was nothing beside the fact that professionally, he had received a real smack in the nose. It would take a long time to repair the damage, if indeed it could ever be repaired. It was a matter of trust. For the foreseeable future, editors would hesitate to publish a story under his byline. He still had plenty of friends in the business who would accept that he had fallen victim to bad luck in unusual circumstances, but he was never again going to be able to make the slightest mistake. What hurt most was the humiliation. He had held all the trumps, and yet he had lost to a semi-gangster in an Armani suit, a despicable stock market speculator, a yuppie with a celebrity lawyer who sneered his way through the whole trial. How in God's name had things gone so wrong? The Wennerström affair had started out with such promise in the cockpit of a 37-foot Mail R-30 on Midsummer Eve a year and a half earlier. It began by chance, all because a former journalist colleague, now a PR flunky at the county council, wanted to impress his new girlfriend. He had rashly hired a scampi for a few days of romantic sailing in the Stockholm archipelago. The girlfriend, just arrived from Hallstahammar to study in Stockholm, had agreed to the outing after putting up token resistance, but only if her sister and her sister's boyfriend could come too. None of the trio from Hallstahammar had any sailing experience, and unfortunately, Blomqvist's old colleague had more enthusiasm than experience. 3 days before they set off, he had called in desperation and persuaded him to come as a fifth crew member, one who knew navigation. Blomqvist had not thought much of the proposal, but he came around when promised a few days of relaxation in the archipelago with good food and pleasant company. These promises came to naught, and the expedition turned into more of a disaster than he could have imagined. They had sailed the beautiful but not very dramatic route from Bullendu up through Furesund Strait at barely 9 knots. But the new girlfriend was instantly seasick. Her sister started arguing with her boyfriend, and none of them showed the slightest interest in learning the least little thing about sailing. It quickly became clear that Blomqvist was expected to take charge of the boat while the others gave him well-intentioned but basically meaningless advice. After the first night in a bay on Ingsu, he was ready to dock the boat at Furesund and take the bus home. Only their desperate appeals persuaded him to stay. At noon the next day, early enough that there were still a few spaces available, they tied up at the visitors' wharf on the picturesque island of Arholma. They had thrown some lunch together and had just finished when Blomqvist noticed a yellow fiberglass M30 gliding into the bay, using only its mainsail. The boat made a graceful tack while the helmsman looked for a spot at the wharf. Blomqvist too scanned the space around and saw that the gap between their scampi and an H-boat on the starboard side was the only slot left. The narrow M30 would just fit. He stood up in the stern and pointed. The man in the M30 raised a hand in thanks and steered towards the wharf. A lone sailor who was not going to bother starting up the engine, Blomqvist noticed. He heard the rattle of the anchor chain, and seconds later the main came down, while the skipper moved like a scalded cat to guide the rudder straight for the slot, and at the same time ready the line from the bow. Blomqvist climbed up on the railing and held out a hand for the painter. The new arrival made one last course correction and glided perfectly up to the stern of the scampi, by now moving very slowly. It was only as the man tossed the painter to Blomqvist that they recognized each other and smiled in delight. "Hi, Robin. Why don't you use your engine so you don't scrape the paint off all the boats in the harbor?" "Hi, Mickey. I thought there was something familiar about you. I'd love to use the engine if I could only get the piece of crap started. It died 2 days ago out by Roadloga." They shook hands across the railings. An eternity before, at Kungsholmen School in the 70s, Blomqvist and Robert Lindberg had been friends, even very good friends. As so often happens with school buddies, the friendship faded after they had gone their separate ways. They had met maybe half a dozen times in the past 20 years, the last one 7 or 8 years ago. Now they studied each other with interest. Lindberg had tangled hair, was tanned, and had a 2-week-old beard. Blomqvist immediately felt in much better spirits. When the PR guy and his silly girlfriend went off to dance around the midsummer pole in front of the general store on the other side of the island, he stayed behind with his herring and aquavit in the cockpit of the M30, shooting the breeze with his old school pal. Sometime that evening, after they had given up the battle with Arholma's notorious mosquitoes and moved down to the cabin, and after quite a few shots of aquavit, the conversation turned to friendly banter about ethics in the corporate world. Lindberg had gone from school to the Stockholm School of Economics and into the banking business. Blomqvist had graduated from the Stockholm School of Journalism and devoted much of his professional life to exposing corruption in the banking and business world. Their talk began to explore what was ethically satisfactory in certain golden parachute agreements during the 90s. Lindberg eventually conceded there were 1 or 2 immoral bastards in the business world. He looked at Blomqvist with an expression that was suddenly serious. "Why don't you write about Hans Erik Wennerström?" "I didn't know there was anything to write about him." Dig, for God's sake. How much do you know about the AIA program?" "Well, it was a sort of assistance program in the 90s to help industry in the former Eastern Bloc countries get back on their feet. It was shut down a couple of years ago. It's nothing I've ever looked into. The Agency for Industrial Assistance was a project that was backed by the state and administered by representatives of about a dozen big Swedish firms. The AIA obtained government guarantees for a number of projects initiated in agreement with the governments in Poland and the Baltics. The Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO, also joined in as a guarantor that the workers' movement in the East would be strengthened as well by following the Swedish model. In theory, it was an assistance project that built on the principle of offering help for self-help. and it was supposed to give the regimes in the East the opportunity to restructure their economies. In practice, however, it meant that Swedish companies would get state subventions for going in and establishing themselves as part owners in companies in Eastern European countries. That goddamned minister in the Christian Party was an ardent advocate of the AIA, which was going to set up a paper mill in Krakow and provide new equipment for a metals industry in Riga, a cement factory in Tallinn, and so on. The funds would be distributed by the AIA board, which consisted of a number of heavyweights from the banking and corporate world. So it was tax money? About half came from government contributions, and the banks and corporations put up the rest. But it was far from an ideal operation. The banks and industry were counting on making a sweet profit. Otherwise, they damn well wouldn't have bothered. How much money are we talking about? Hold on, listen to this. The AIA was dealing primarily with big Swedish firms who wanted to get into the Eastern European market. Heavy industries like Asia Brown, Bovary, and Skanska Construction and the like. Not speculation firms, in other words. Are you telling me that Skanska doesn't do speculation? Wasn't it their managing director who was fired after he let some of his boys speculate away $500 million in quick stock turnovers? And how about their hysterical property deals in London and Oslo? Sure, there are idiots in every company the world over, but you know what I mean. At least those companies actually produce something, the backbone of Swedish industry and all that. Where does Wennerström come into the picture? Wennerström is the joker in the pack, meaning that he's a guy who turns up out of the blue, who has no background whatsoever in heavy industry, and who really has no business getting involved in these projects, but he has amassed a colossal fortune on the stock market and has invested in solid companies. He came in by the back door, so to speak. As he sat there in the boat, Blomqvist filled his glass with Reimersholm's brandy and leaned back, trying to remember what little he knew about Wennerström. Born up in Norrland, where in the 70s he set up an investment company. He made money and moved to Stockholm, and there his career took off in the 80s. He created Wennerström Gruppen, the Wennerström Group, when they set up offices in London and New York, and the company started to get mentioned in the same articles as Bayer. He traded stock and options and liked to make quick deals, and he emerged in the celebrity press as one of Sweden's numerous billionaires with a city home on Strandvägen, a fabulous summer villa on the island of Värmdö, and an 82-foot motor yacht that he bought from a bankrupt former tennis star. He was a bean counter, naturally, but the 80s was the decade of the bean counters and property speculators, and Wennerström had not made a significantly big splash. On the contrary, he had remained something of a man in the shadows among his peers. He lacked John Stenbeck's flamboyance and did not spread himself all over the tabloids like Percy Barnevik. He said goodbye to real estate and instead made massive investments in the former Eastern Bloc. When the bubble burst in the 90s and one managing director after another was forced to cash in his golden parachute, Wennerström's company came out of it in remarkably good shape. A Swedish success story, as the Financial Times called it. That was 1992, Lindbergh said. Wennerström contacted AIA and said he wanted funding. He presented a plan, seemingly backed by interests in Poland, which aimed at establishing an industry for the manufacture of packaging for foodstuffs. A tin can industry, you mean? Not quite, but something along those lines. I have no idea who he knew at the AIA, but he walked out with 60 million kroner. This is starting to get interesting. Let me guess. That was the last anyone saw of the money. Wrong. Lindbergh gave a sly smile before he fortified himself with a few more sips of brandy. What happened after that is a piece of classic bookkeeping. Wennerström really did set up a packaging factory in Poland, in Lodz. The company was called Minos. AIA received a few enthusiastic reports during 1993, then silence. In 1994, Minos, out of the blue, collapsed. Lindbergh put his empty glass down with an emphatic smack. The problem with AIA was that there was no real system in place for reporting on the project. You remember those days? Everyone was so optimistic when the Berlin Wall came down. Democracy was going to be introduced, the threat of nuclear war was over, and the Bolsheviks would turn into regular little capitalists overnight. The government wanted to nail down democracy in the East. Every capitalist wanted to jump on the bandwagon and help build the new Europe. I didn't know that capitalists were so anxious to get involved in charity. Believe me, it was a capitalist's wet dream. Russia and Eastern Europe may be the world's biggest untapped markets after China. Industry had no problem joining hands with the government, especially when the companies were required to put up only a token investment. In all, AIA swallowed about 30 billion kroner of the taxpayers' money. It was supposed to come back in future profits. Formally, AIA was the government's initiative, but the influence of industry was so great that in actual fact, the AIA board was operating independently. So is there a story in all this? Be patient. When the project started, there was no problem with financing. Sweden hadn't yet been hit by the interest rate shock. The government was happy to plug AIA as one of the biggest Swedish efforts to promote democracy in the East. And this was all under the conservative government. Don't get politics mixed up in this. It's all about money, and it makes no difference if the Social Democrats or the moderates appoint the ministers. So, full speed ahead. Then came the foreign exchange problems, and after that, some crazy new Democrats, remember them? Started whining that there was a shortage of oversight in what AIA was into. One of their henchmen had confused AIA with the Swedish International Development Authority and thought it was all some damn do-gooder project like the one in Tanzania. In the spring of 1994, a commission was appointed to investigate. At that time, there were concerns about several projects, but one of the first to be investigated was Minos. And Wennerström couldn't show what the funds had been used for. Far from it. He produced an excellent report which showed that around 54 million kroner was invested in Minos. But it turned out that there were too many huge administrative problems in what was left of Poland for a modern packaging industry to be able to function. In practice, their factory was shut out by the competition from a similar German project. The Germans were doing their best to buy up the entire Eastern Bloc. You said that he had been given 60 million kroner? Exactly. The money served as an interest-free loan. The idea, of course, was that the companies would pay back part of the money over a number of years. But Minos had gone under and Wennerström could not be blamed for it. Here the state guarantees kicked in, and Wennerström was indemnified. All he needed to do was pay back the money that was lost when Minos went under, and he could also show that he had lost a corresponding amount of his own money. Let me see if I understand this correctly. The government supplied billions in tax money and diplomats to open doors. Industries got the money and used it to invest in joint ventures from which they later reaped vast profits. In other words, business as usual. You're a cynic. The loans were supposed to be paid back to the state. You said that they were interest-free, so that means the taxpayers got nothing at all for putting up the cash. Wennerström got 60 million and invested 54 million of it. What happened to the other 6 million? When it became clear that the AIA project was going to be investigated, Wennerström sent a check for 6 million to AIA for the difference. So the matter was settled, legally at least. It sounds as though Wennerström frittered away a little money for AIA. But compared with the $500 million that disappeared from Skanska or the CEO of ABB's golden parachute of more than 1 billion kroner, which really upset people, this doesn't seem to be much to write about, Blomqvist said. Today's readers are pretty tired of stories about incompetent speculators, even if it's with public funds. Is there more to the story? It gets better. How do you know all this about Wennerström's deals in Poland? I worked at Handelsbanken in the 90s. Guess who wrote the reports for the bank's representative in AIA? Tell me more. Well, AIA got their report from Wennerström. Documents were drawn up. The balance of the money had been paid back. That 6 million coming back was very clever. Get to the point. But my dear Blomqvist, that is the point. AIA was satisfied with Wennerström's report. It was an investment that went to hell, but there was no criticism of the way it had been managed. We looked at invoices and transfers and all the documents. Everything was meticulously accounted for. I believed it. My boss believed it. AIA believed it, and the government had nothing to say. Where's the hook? This is where the story gets ticklish, Lindbergh said, looking surprisingly sober. And since you're a journalist, this is off the record. Come off it. You can't sit there telling me all this stuff and then say I can't use it. I certainly can. What I've told you so far is in the public record. You can look up the report if you want. The rest of the story, what I haven't told you, you can write about, but you'll have to treat me as an anonymous source. Okay, but off the record in current terminology means that I've been told something in confidence and can't write about it. Screw the terminology. Write whatever the hell you want, but I'm your anonymous source. Are we agreed? Of course, Blomqvist said. In hindsight, this was a mistake. All right then. The Minos story took place more than a decade ago, just after the wall came down and the Bolsheviks starting acting like decent capitalists. I was one of the people who investigated Wennerstrom, and the whole time I thought there was something damned odd about his story. Why didn't you say so when you signed off on his report? I discussed it with my boss, but the problem was that there wasn't anything to pinpoint. The documents were all okay. I had only to sign the report. Every time I've seen Wennerstrom's name in the press since then, I think about Minos. And not least because some years later, in the mid-90s, my bank was doing some business with Wennerstrom. Pretty big business, actually, and it didn't turn out so well. He cheated you? No, nothing that obvious. We both made money on the deals. It was more that I don't know quite how to explain it, and now I'm talking about my own employer, and I don't want to do that. But what struck me, the lasting and overall impression, as they say, was not positive. Wennerstrom is presented in the media as a tremendous financial oracle. He thrives on that. It's his trust capital. I know what you mean. My impression was that the man was all bluff. He wasn't even particularly bright as a financier. In fact, I thought he was damned ignorant about certain subjects, although he had some really sharp young warriors for advisors. Above all, I really didn't care for him personally. So, a few years ago, I went down to Poland on some other matter. Our group had dinner with some investors in Lodz, and I found myself at the same table as the mayor. We talked about the difficulty of getting Poland's economy on its feet and all that, and somehow or other, I mentioned the Minos project. The mayor looked quite astonished for a moment, as if he had never heard of Minos. He told me it was some crummy little business and nothing ever came of it. He laughed and said, I'm quoting word for word, that if that was the best our investors could manage, then Sweden wasn't long for this life. Are you following me? That mayor of Lodz is obviously a sharp fellow, but go on. The next day I had a meeting in the morning, but the rest of my day was free. For the hell of it, I drove out to look at the shut-down Minos factory in a small town outside of Lodz. The giant Minos factory was a ramshackle structure, a corrugated iron storage building that the Red Army had built in the 50s. I found a watchman on the property who could speak a little German and discovered that one of his cousins had worked at Minos, and we went over to his house nearby. The watchman interpreted. Are you interested in hearing what he had to say? I can hardly wait. Minos opened in the autumn of 1992. There were at most 15 employees, the majority of them old women. Their pay was around 150 kroner a month. At first, there were no machines, so the workforce spent their time cleaning up the place. In early October, 3 cardboard box machines arrived from Portugal. They were old and completely obsolete. The scrap value couldn't have been more than a few thousand kroner. The machines did work, but they kept breaking down. Naturally, there were no spare parts, so Minos suffered endless stoppages. This is starting to sound like a story, Blomqvist said. What did they make at Minos? Throughout 1992 and half of 1993, they produced simple cardboard boxes for washing powders and egg cartons and the like. Then they started making paper bags. But the factory could never get enough raw materials, so there was never a question of much volume of production. This doesn't sound like a gigantic investment. I ran the numbers. The total rent must have been around 15,000 kroner for 2 years. Wages may have amounted to 150,000 SEK at most, and I'm being generous here. Cost of machines and cost of freight. A van to deliver the egg cartons. I'm guessing 250,000. Add fees for permits, a little traveling back and forth. Apparently one person from Sweden did visit the site a few times. It looks as though the whole operation ran for under 2 million. One day in the summer of 1993, the foreman came down to the factory and said it was shut down, and a while later, a Hungarian lorry appeared and carried off the machinery. Bye-bye, Minos. In the course of the trial, Blomqvist had often thought of that midsummer eve. For large parts of the evening, the tone of the conversation made it feel as if they were back at school, having a friendly argument. As teenagers, they had shared the burdens common to that stage in life. As grown-ups, they were effectively strangers, by now quite different sorts of people. During their talk, Blomqvist had thought that he really could not recall what it was that had made them such friends at school. He remembered Lindbergh as a reserve boy, incredibly shy with girls. As an adult, he was a successful, well, climber in the banking world. He rarely got drunk, but that chance meeting had transformed a disastrous sailing trip into a pleasant evening. And because the conversation had so much an echo of a schoolboy tone, he did not at first take Lindbergh's story about Wennerstrom seriously. Gradually, his professional instincts were aroused. Eventually, he was listening attentively, and the logical objections surfaced. "Wait a second," he said. "Wennerstrom is a top name among market speculators. He's made himself a billion, has he not? The Wennerstrom Group is sitting on somewhere close to 200 billion. You're going to ask why a billionaire should go to the trouble of swindling a trifling 50 million. Well, put it this way. Why would he risk his own and his company's good name on such a blatant swindle?" It wasn't so obviously a swindle, given that the AIA board, the bankers, the government, and Parliament's auditors all approved Wennerstrom's accounting without a single dissenting vote. It's still a ridiculously small sum for so vast a risk. Certainly, but just think. The Wennerstrom Group is an investment company that deals with property, securities, options, foreign exchange, you name it. Wennerstrom contacted AIA in 1992, just as the bottom was about to drop out of the market. Do you remember the autumn of 1992? Do I? I had a variable rate mortgage on my apartment when the interest rate shot up 500% in October. I was stuck with 19% interest for a year. Those were indeed the days, Lindbergh said. I lost a bundle that year myself, and Hans-Erik Wennerstrom, like every other player in the market, was wrestling with the same problem. The company had billions tied up in paper of various types, but not so much cash. All of a sudden, they could no longer borrow any amount they liked. The usual thing in such a situation is to unload a few properties and lick your wounds, but in 1992, nobody wanted to buy real estate. Cash flow problems. Exactly. And Wennerstrom wasn't the only one. Every businessman, don't say businessman, call them what you like, but calling them businessmen is an insult to a serious profession. All right, every speculator had cash flow problems. Look at it this way. Wennerstrom got 60 million kroner. He paid back 6 mil, but only after 3 years. The real cost of Minos didn't come to more than 2 million. The interest alone on 60 million for 3 years, that's quite a bit. Depending on how he invested the money, he might have doubled the AIA money, or maybe grown it 10 times over. Then we're no longer talking about cat shit. Skål, by the way. Chapter 2. Friday, December 20th. Dragan Armansky was born in Croatia 56 years ago. His father was an Armenian Jew from Belarusia. His mother was a Bosnian Muslim of Greek extraction. She had taken charge of his upbringing and his education, which meant that as an adult he was lumped together with that large, heterogeneous group defined by the media as Muslims. The Swedish immigration authorities had registered him, strangely enough, as a Serb. His passport confirmed that he was a Swedish citizen, and his passport photograph showed a squarish face, a strong jaw, 5 o'clock shadow, and graying temples. He was often referred to as the Arab, although he did not have a drop of Arab blood. He looked a little like the stereotypical local boss in an American gangster movie, but in fact he was a talented financial director who had begun his career as a junior accountant at Milton Security in the early 70s. 3 decades later, he had advanced to CEO and COO of the company. He had become fascinated with the security business. It was like war games, to identify threats, develop counter strategies, and all the time stay one step ahead of the industrial spies, blackmailers, and thieves. It began for him when he discovered how the swindling of a client had been accomplished through creative bookkeeping. He was able to prove who, from a group of a dozen people, was behind it. He had been promoted and played a key role in the firm's development and was an expert in financial fraud. 15 years later, he became CEO. He had transformed Milton Security into one of Sweden's most competent and trusted security firms. The company had 380 full-time employees and another 300 freelancers. It was small compared to Falck or Swedish Guard Service. When Armansky first joined, the company was called Johann Frederick Milton's General Security AB, and it had a client list consisting of shopping centers that needed floor walkers and muscular guards. Under his leadership, the firm was now the internationally recognized Milton Security and had invested in cutting-edge technology. Night watchmen well past their prime, uniform fetishists, and moonlighting university students had been replaced by people with real professional skills. Armansky hired mature ex-policemen as operations chiefs, political scientists specializing in international terrorism, and experts in personal protection and industrial espionage. Most importantly, he hired the best telecommunications technicians and IT experts. The company moved from Solna to state-of-the-art offices near Slussen in the heart of Stockholm. By the start of the 90s, Milton Security was equipped to offer a new level of security to an exclusive group of clients, primarily medium-sized corporations and well-to-do private individuals, nouveau riche rock stars, stock market speculators, and dot-com high flyers. A part of the company's activity was providing bodyguard protection and security solutions to Swedish firms abroad, especially in the Middle East. This area of their business now accounted for 70% of the company's turnover. Under Armansky, sales had increased from about 40 million SEK annually to almost 2 billion. Providing security was a lucrative business. Operations were divided among three main areas. Security consultations, which consisted of identifying conceivable or imagined threats. Countermeasures, which usually involved the installation of security cameras, burglar and fire alarms, electronic locking mechanisms and IT systems, and personal protection for private individuals or companies. This last market had grown 40 times over in 10 years. Lately, a new client group had arisen, affluent women seeking protection from former boyfriends or husbands or from stalkers. In addition, Milton Security had a cooperative arrangement with similar firms of good repute in Europe and the United States. The company also handled security for many international visitors to Sweden, including an American actress who was shooting a film for 2 months in Trollhättan. Her agent felt that her status warranted having bodyguards accompany her whenever she took her infrequent walks near the hotel. A fourth, considerably smaller area that occupied only a few employees was what was called PI or PN, in internal jargon PINDers, which stood for Personal Investigations. Armansky was not altogether enamored of this part of their business. It was troublesome and less lucrative. It put greater demands on the employee's judgment and experience than on their knowledge of telecommunications technology or the installation of surveillance apparatus. Personal investigations were acceptable when it was a matter of credit information, background checks before hiring, or to investigate suspicions that some employee had leaked company information or engaged in criminal activity. In such cases, the PINDers were an integral part of the operational activity, but not infrequently his business clients would drag in private problems that had a tendency to create unwelcome turmoil. I want to know what sort of creep my daughter's going out with. I think my wife is being unfaithful. The guy's okay, but he's mixed up with bad company. I'm being blackmailed. Armansky often gave them a straightforward no. If the daughter was an adult, she had the right to go out with any creep she wanted to, and he thought infidelity was something that husbands and wives ought to work out on their own. Hidden in all such inquiries were traps that could lead to scandal and create legal problems. For Milton's security, which was why Dragan Armansky kept a close watch on these assignments, in spite of how modest the revenue was. The morning's topic was just such a personal investigation. Armansky straightened the crease in his trousers before he leaned back in his comfortable chair. He glanced suspiciously at his colleague Lisbeth Salander, who was 32 years his junior. He thought for the 1,000th time that nobody seemed more out of place in a prestigious security firm than she did. His mistrust was both wise and irrational. In Armansky's eyes, Salander was beyond doubt the most able investigator he had met in all his years in the business. During the 4 years she had worked for him, she had never once fumbled a job or turned in a single mediocre report. On the contrary, her reports were in a class by themselves. Armansky was convinced that she possessed a unique gift. Anybody could find out credit information or run a check with police records. But Salander had imagination, and she always came back with something different from what he expected. How she did it, he had never understood. Sometimes he thought that her ability to gather information was sheer magic. She knew the bureaucratic archives inside out. Above all, she had the ability to get under the skin of the person she was investigating. If there was any dirt to be dug up, she would home in on it like a cruise missile. Somehow, she had always had this gift. Her reports could be a catastrophe for the individual who landed in her radar. Armansky would never forget the time he assigned her to do a routine check on a researcher in the pharmaceutical industry before a corporate buyout. The job was scheduled to take a week, but it dragged on for a while. After 4 weeks' silence and several reminders, which she ignored, Solander came back with a report documenting that the subject in question was a pedophile. On 2 occasions, he had bought sex from a 13-year-old child prostitute in Tallinn, and there were indications that he had an unhealthy interest in the daughter of the woman with whom he was currently living. Solander had habits that sometimes drove Armansky to the edge of despair. In the case of the pedophile, she did not pick up the telephone and call Armansky or come into his office wanting to talk to him. No, without indicating by a single word that the report might contain explosive material, she laid it on his desk one evening, just as Armansky was about to leave for the day. He read it only late that evening, as he was relaxing over a bottle of wine in front of the TV with his wife in their villa on Lidingö. The report was, as always, almost scientifically precise, with footnotes, quotations, and source references. The first few pages gave the subject's background, education, career, and financial situation. Not until page 24 did Solander drop the bombshell about the trips to Tallinn in the same dry-as-dust tone she used to report that he lived in Sollentuna and drove a dark blue Volvo. She referred to documentation in an exhaustive appendix, including photographs of the 13-year-old girl in the company of the subject. The pictures had been taken in a hotel corridor in Tallinn, and the man had his hand under the girl's sweater. Solander had tracked down the girl in question, and she had provided her account on tape. The report had created precisely the chaos that Armansky had wanted to avoid. First, he had to swallow a few ulcer tablets prescribed by his doctor. Then he called in the client for a somber emergency meeting. Finally, over the client's fierce objections, he was forced to refer the material to the police. This meant that Milton's security risked being drawn into a tangled web. If Solander's evidence could not be substantiated or the man was acquitted, the company might risk a libel suit. It was a nightmare. However, it was not Lisbeth Solander's astonishing lack of emotional involvement that most upset him. Milton's image was one of conservative stability. Solander fitted into this picture about as well as a buffalo at a boat show. Armansky's star researcher was a pale, anorexic young woman who had hair as short as a fuse and a pierced nose and eyebrows. She had a wasp tattoo about an inch long on her neck, a tattooed loop around the biceps of her left arm, and another around her left ankle. On those occasions, when she had been wearing a tank top, Armansky also saw that she had a dragon tattoo on her left shoulder blade. She was a natural redhead, but she dyed her hair raven black. She looked as though she had just emerged from a week-long orgy with a gang of hard rockers. She did not in fact have an eating disorder, Armansky was sure of that. On the contrary, she seemed to consume every kind of junk food. She had simply been born thin, with slender bones that made her look girlish and fine-limbed with small hands, narrow wrists, and childlike breasts. She was 24, but she sometimes looked 14. She had a wide mouth, a small nose, and high cheekbones that gave her an almost Asian look. Her movements were quick and spidery, and when she was working at the computer, her fingers flew over the keys. Her extreme slenderness would have made a career in modeling impossible, but with the right makeup, her face could have put her on any billboard in the world. Sometimes she wore black lipstick, and in spite of the tattoos and the pierced nose and eyebrows, she was, well, attractive. It was inexplicable. The fact that Solander worked for Dragan Armansky at all was astonishing. She was not the sort of woman with whom he would normally come into contact. She had been hired as a Jill of all trades. Holger Palmgren, a semi-retired lawyer who looked after old J.F. Milton's personal affairs, had told Armansky that this Lisbeth Solander was a quick-witted girl with a rather trying attitude. Palmgren had appealed to him to give her a chance, which Armansky had, against his better judgment, promised to do. Palmgren was the type of man who would only take no as an encouragement to redouble his efforts, so it was easier to say yes right away. Armansky knew that Palmgren devoted himself to troubled kids and other social misfits. But he did have good judgment. He had regretted his decision to hire the girl the moment he met her. She did not just seem difficult. In his eyes, she was the very quintessence of difficult. She had dropped out of school and had no sort of higher education. The first few months she had worked full-time, well, almost full-time. She turned up at the office now and then. She made coffee, went to the post office, and took care of the copying, but conventional office hours or work routines were anathema to her. On the other hand, she had a talent for irritating the other employees. She became known as the girl with two brain cells, one for breathing and one for standing up. She never talked about herself. Colleagues who tried to talk to her seldom got a response and soon gave up. Her attitude encouraged neither trust nor friendship, and she quickly became an outsider, wandering the corridors of Milton like a stray cat. She was generally considered a hopeless case. After a month of nothing but trouble, Armansky sent for her, fully intending to let her go. She listened to his catalog of her offenses without objection and without even raising an eyebrow. She did not have the right attitude, he concluded, and was about to tell her that it would probably be a good idea if she looked for employment with another firm that could make better use of her skills. Only then did she interrupt him. "You know, if you just want an office serf, you can get one from the temp agency. I can handle anything and anyone you want. And if you don't have any better use for me than sorting posts, then you're an idiot." Armansky sat there stunned and angry, and she went on unperturbed. "You have a man here who spent 3 weeks writing a completely useless report about that yuppie they're thinking of recruiting for that .com company. I copied the piece of crap for him last night, and I see it's lying on your desk now." Armansky's eyes went to the report, and for a change he raised his voice. "You're not supposed to read confidential reports." "Apparently not, but the security routines in your firm have a number of shortcomings. According to your directive, he's supposed to copy such things himself, but he chucked the report at me before he left for the bar yesterday. And by the way, I found his previous report in the canteen." "You did what?" "Calm down. I put it in his inbox." "Did he give you the combination to his document safe?" Armansky was aghast. "Not exactly. He wrote it on a piece of paper he kept underneath his blotter, along with the password to his computer. But the point is that your joke of a private detective has done a worthless personal investigation. He missed the fact that the guy has old gambling debts and snorts cocaine like a vacuum cleaner. Or that his girlfriend had to seek help from the Women's Crisis Center after he beat the shit out of her." Armansky sat for a couple of minutes turning the pages of the report. It was competently set out, written in clear language, and filled with source references as well as statements from the subject's friends and acquaintances. Finally, he raised his eyes and said 2 words. "Prove it." "How much time have I got?" 3 days. If you can't prove your allegations by Friday afternoon, you're fired." 3 days later, she delivered a report which, with equally exhaustive source references, transformed the outwardly pleasant young yuppie into an unreliable bastard. Armansky read her report over the weekend, several times, and spent part of Monday doing a half-hearted double-check of some of her assertions. Even before he began, he knew that her information would prove to be accurate. Armansky was bewildered and also angry with himself for having so obviously misjudged her. He had taken her for stupid, maybe even retarded. He had not expected that a girl who had cut so many classes in school that she did not graduate could write a report so grammatically correct. It also contained detailed observations and information, and he quite simply could not comprehend how she could have acquired such facts. He could not imagine that anyone else at Milton Security would have lifted excerpts from the confidential journal of a doctor at a women's crisis center. When he asked her how she had managed that, she told him that she had no intention of burning her sources. It became clear that Solander was not going to discuss her work methods, either with him or with anyone else. This disturbed him, but not enough for him to resist the temptation to test her. He thought about the matter for several days. He recalled Holger Palmgren's saying, when he had sent her to him, "Everyone deserves a chance." He thought about his own Muslim upbringing, which had taught him that it was his duty to God to help the outcasts. Of course, he did not believe in God and had not been in a mosque since he was a teenager, but he recognized Lisbeth Salander as a person in need of resolute help. He had not done much along these lines over the past few decades, Instead of giving Salander the boot, he summoned her for a meeting in which he tried to work out what made the difficult girl tick. His impression was confirmed that she suffered from some serious emotional problem, but he also discovered that behind her sullen facade, there was an unusual intelligence. He found her prickly and irksome, but much to his surprise, he began to like her. Over the following months, Armansky took Salander under his wing. In truth, he took her on as a small social project. He gave her straightforward research tasks and tried to give her guidelines on how to proceed. She would listen patiently and then set off to carry out the assignment just as she saw fit. He asked Milton's technical director to give her a basic course in IT science. They sat together all afternoon until he reported back that she seemed to have a better understanding of computers than most of the staff. But despite development discussions, offers of in-house training, and other forms of enticement, it was evident that Salander had no intention of adapting to Milton's office routines. This put Armansky in a difficult spot. He would not have put up with any other employee coming and going at will, and under normal circumstances, he would have demanded that she change or go. But he had a hunch that if he gave Salander an ultimatum or threatened to fire her, she would simply shrug her shoulders and be gone. A more serious problem was that he could not be sure of his own feelings for the young woman. She was like a nagging itch, repellent and at the same time tempting. It was not a sexual attraction, at least he did not think so. The women he was usually attracted to were blonde and curvaceous, with full lips that aroused his fantasies. And besides, he had been married for 20 years to a Finnish woman named Ritva, who still more than satisfied these requirements. He had never been unfaithful. Well, something may have happened just once, and his wife might have misunderstood if she had known about it. But the marriage was happy, and he had 2 daughters of Salander's age. In any case, he was not interested in flat-chested girls who might be mistaken for skinny boys at a distance. That was not his style. Even so, he had caught himself having inappropriate daydreams about Lisbeth Salander, and he recognized that he was not completely unaffected by her. But the attraction, Armansky thought, was that Salander was a foreign creature to him. He might just as well have fallen in love with a painting of a nymph or a Greek amphora. Salander represented a life that was not real for him, that fascinated him though he could not share it, and in any case she forbade him from sharing it. On one occasion, Armansky was sitting at a cafe on Stortorget in Gamla Stan when Salander came sauntering up and sat at a table a short distance away. She was with 3 girls and a boy, all dressed in much the same way. Armansky had watched her with interest. She seemed to be just as reserved as she was at work, but she had actually almost smiled at a story told by one of her companions, a girl with purple hair. Armansky wondered how she would react if one day he came to work with green hair, worn-out jeans, and a leather jacket covered with graffiti and rivets. She probably would just smirk at him. She had been sitting with her back to him and did not turn around once, obviously unaware that he was there. He felt strangely disturbed by her presence. When at last he got up to slink away, unnoticed, she suddenly turned and stared straight at him, as though she had been aware all the time that he was sitting there and had him on her radar. Her gaze had come so surprisingly that it felt like an attack, and he pretended not to see her and hurriedly left the cafe. She had not said hello even, but she followed him with her eyes, he was sure of it, and not until he turned the corner did they stop burning into his neck. She rarely laughed, but over time Armansky thought he noticed a softening of her attitude. She had a dry sense of humor, to put it mildly, which could prompt a crooked, ironic smile. Armansky felt so provoked by her lack of emotional response that sometimes he wanted to grab hold of her and shake her, to force his way into her shell and win her friendship, or at least her respect. Only once, after she had been working for him for 9 months, had he tried to discuss these feelings with her. It was at Milton Security's Christmas party one evening in December, and for once he was not sober. Nothing inappropriate had happened. He had just tried to tell her that he actually liked her. Most of all, he wanted to explain that he felt protective towards her, and if she ever needed help with anything, she should not hesitate to come to him. He had even tried to give her a hug. All in friendliness, of course. She had wriggled out of his clumsy embrace and left the party. After that, she had not appeared at the office or answered her mobile. Her absence had felt like torture, almost a form of personal punishment. He had nobody to discuss his feelings with, and for the first time he realized with appalling clarity what a destructive hold she had over him. 3 weeks later, when Armansky was working late one evening, going over the year-end bookkeeping, Salander reappeared. She came into his office as silently as a ghost, and he became aware that she was standing in the shadows inside the doorway, watching him. He had no idea how long. She had been there. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. She handed him a cup from the espresso machine in the canteen. Mutely he accepted it, feeling both relief and terror when she shoved the door closed with her foot. She sat down opposite his desk and looked him straight in the eye. Then she asked the question in a way that could neither be laughed off nor avoided. "Dragon, are you attracted to me?" Armansky sat as if paralyzed, while desperately wondering how to answer. His first impulse was to pretend to be insulted. Then he saw her expression, and it came to him that this was the first time she had ever uttered any such personal question. It was seriously meant, and if he tried to laugh it off, she would take it as an affront. She wanted to talk to him, and he wondered how long it had taken her to get up the courage to ask that question. He slowly put down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Finally, he relaxed. "What makes you think that?" he said. "The way you look at me, and the way you don't look at me, and the times you were about to reach out your hand and touch me, but stopped yourself." He smiled at her. "I reckon you'd bite off my hand if I laid a finger on you." She did not smile. She was waiting. "Lisbeth, I'm your boss, and even if I were attracted to you, I'd never act on it." She was still waiting. "Between us, yes, there have been times when I have felt attracted to you. I can't explain it, but that's the way it is. For some reason I don't really understand. I like you a lot, but it's not a physical thing." "That's good, because it'll never happen." Armansky laughed, the first time she had said something personal, and it was the most disheartening news a man could imagine receiving. He struggled to find the right words. "Lisbeth, I understand that you're not interested in an old man of 50 plus. I'm not interested in an old man of 50 plus who's my boss." She held up a hand. "Wait, let me speak. You're sometimes stupid and maddeningly bureaucratic, but you're actually an attractive man. And I can also feel, but you're my boss, and I've met your wife, and I want to keep my job with you. And the most idiotic thing I could do is get involved with you." Armansky said nothing, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm aware of what you've done for me, and I'm not ungrateful. I appreciate that you actually showed yourself to be greater than your prejudices and have given me a chance here. But I don't want you for my lover, and you're not my father." After a while, Armansky sighed helplessly. "What exactly do you want from me?" "I want to continue working for you, if that's okay with you." He nodded and then answered her as honestly as he could. "I really do want you to work for me, but I also want you to feel some sort of friendship and trust in me." She nodded. "You're not a person who encourages friendship," he said. She seemed to withdraw, but he went on. "I understand that you don't want anyone interfering in your life, and I'll try not to do that. But is it all right if I continue to like you?" Salander thought about it for a long time. Then she replied by getting up, walking around the desk, and giving him a hug. He was totally shocked. Only when she released him did he take her hand. "We can be friends?" She nodded once. That was the only time she ever showed him any tenderness, and the only time she ever touched him. It was a moment that Armansky fondly remembered. After 4 years, she had still vouchsafed hardly a detail about her private life or her background to Armansky. Once he applied his own knowledge of the Pinder's art on her. He also had a long talk with Holger Palmgren, who did not seem surprised to see him, and what he finally found out did not increase his trust in her. He never mentioned a word about this to her or let her know that he had been snooping into her life. Instead, he hid his uneasiness and increased his watchfulness. Before that strange evening was over, Armansky and Salander had come to an agreement. In future, she would do research projects for him on a freelance basis. She would receive a small monthly income, whether she did any assignments or not. The real money would be made when she was paid per assignment. She could work the way she wanted to. In return, she pledged never to do anything that might embarrass him or risk subjecting Milton Security to scandal. For Armansky, this was a solution that was advantageous to him the company, and Solander herself. He cut the troublesome PI department down to a single full-time employee, an older colleague who handled routine jobs perfectly well and ran credit checks. All complicated or tricky assignments he turned over to Solander and a few other freelancers who, in the last resort, were independent contractors for whom Milton Security had actually no responsibility. Since he regularly engaged her services, she earned a good salary. It could have been much higher, but Solander worked only when she felt like it. Armansky accepted her as she was, but she was not allowed to meet the clients. Today's assignment was an exception. Solander was dressed for the day in a black t-shirt with a picture on it of E.T. with fangs, and the words, "I am also an alien." She had on a black skirt that was frayed at the hem, a worn-out black, mid-length leather jacket, rivet belt, heavy Doc Marten boots, and horizontally striped green and red knee socks. She had put on makeup in a color scheme that indicated she might be colorblind. In other words, she was exceptionally decked out. Armansky sighed and shifted his gaze to the conservatively dressed guest with the thick glasses. Dirch Frode, a lawyer, had insisted on meeting and being able to ask questions of the employee who prepared the report. Armansky had done all he civilly could to prevent the meeting taking place, saying that Solander had a cold, was away, or was swamped with other work. The lawyer replied calmly that it made no difference. The matter was not urgent, and he could easily wait a couple of days. At last, there was no way to avoid bringing them together. Now Frode, who seemed to be in his late 60s, was looking at Lisbeth Solander with evident fascination. Solander glowered back with an expression that did not indicate any warm feelings. Armansky sighed and looked once more at the folder she had placed on his desk labeled Carl Michael Blomqvist. The name was followed by a social security number, neatly printed on the cover. He said the name out loud. Herr Frode snapped out of his bewitched state and turned to Armansky. "So what can you tell me about Michael Blomqvist?" he said. "This is Ms. Solander, who prepared the report." Armansky hesitated a second and then went on with a smile that was intended to engender confidence, but which seemed helplessly apologetic. "Don't be fooled by her youth. She is our absolute best researcher." "I'm persuaded of that," Frode said in a dry tone that hinted at the opposite. "Tell me what she found out." It was clear that Frode had no idea how to act towards Solander. He resorted to directing the question to Armansky, as if she had not been in the room. Solander blew a big bubble with her gum. Before Armansky could answer, she said, "Could you ask the client whether he would prefer the long or the short version?" There was a brief, embarrassed silence before Frode finally turned to Solander and tried to repair the damage by assuming a friendly, avuncular tone. "I would be grateful if the young lady would give me a verbal summary of the results." For a moment, her expression was so surprisingly hostile that it sent a cold shiver down Frode's spine. Then just as quickly, her expression softened, and Frode wondered whether he had imagined that look. When she began to speak, she sounded like a civil servant. "Allow me to say first that this was not a very complicated assignment, apart from the fact that the description of the task itself was somewhat vague. You wanted to know everything that could be dug up about him, but gave no indication of whether there were anything in particular you were looking for. For this reason, it's something of a potpourri of his life. The report is 193 pages long, but 120 pages are copies of articles he wrote or press clippings. Blomqvist is a public person with few secrets and not very much to hide." "But he does have some secrets?" Frode said. "Everyone has secrets," she replied neutrally. "It's just a matter of finding out what they are." "Let's hear." Michael Blomqvist was born on January 18, 1960, which makes him 42 years old. He was born in Borlänge but has never lived there. His parents, Kurt and Anita Blomqvist, were around 35 when the child was born. Both have since died. His father was a machinery installer and moved around a good deal. His mother, as far as I could see, was never anything but a housewife. The family moved house to Stockholm when Mikael started school. He has a sister 3 years younger named Annika, who is a lawyer. He also has some cousins, both male and female. "Were you planning to serve coffee?" This last was directed at Armansky, who hastily pumped 3 cups of coffee from the thermos he had ordered for the meeting. He motioned for Solander to go on. "So in 1966, the family lived in Lilla Essingen. Blomqvist went to school first in Blomma and then to prep school on Kungsholmen. He had decent graduating marks. There are copies in the folder. During his prep school days, he studied music and played bass in a rock band named Bootstrap, which actually put out a single that was played on the radio in the summer of 1979. After prep school, he worked as a ticket collector in the Tunnelbana, saved some money, and traveled abroad. He was away for a year, mostly bumming around Asia, India, Thailand, and a swing down to Australia. He began studying to be a journalist in Stockholm when he was 21, but interrupted his studies after the first year to do his military service as a rifleman in Kiruna in Lapland. It was some sort of macho unit, and he left with good marks. After military service, he completed his journalism degree and has worked in the field ever since. How detailed do you want me to be? Just tell what you think is important. He comes off a little like Practical Pig in The Three Little Pigs. So far, he has been an excellent journalist. In the 80s, he had a lot of temporary jobs, first in the provincial press and then in Stockholm. There's a list. His breakthrough came with the story about the Bear Gang, the bank robbers he identified. Kalle Blomqvist. He hates the nickname, which is understandable. Somebody'd get a fat lip if they ever called me Pippi Longstocking on a newspaper placard. She cast a dark look at Armansky, who swallowed hard. On more than one occasion, he had thought of Solander as precisely Pippi Longstocking. He waved for her to get on with it. One source declares that up to then he wanted to be a crime reporter, and he interned as one at an evening paper. But he has become known for his work as a political and financial reporter. He has primarily been a freelancer with one full-time position at an evening paper in the late 80s. He left in 1990 when he helped start the monthly magazine Millennium. The magazine began as a real outsider, without any big publishing company to hold its hand. Its circulation has grown and today is 21,000 copies monthly. The editorial office is on Gutgatan, only a few blocks from here. A left-wing magazine. That depends on how you define the concept left-wing. Millennium is generally viewed as critical of society, but I'm guessing the anarchists think it's a wimpy bourgeois crap magazine along the lines of Arena or Ordfront, while the Moderate Students Association probably thinks that the editors are all Bolsheviks. There is nothing to indicate that Blomqvist has ever been active politically, even during the left-wing wave when he was going to prep school. While he was plugging away at the School of Journalism, he was living with a girl who at the time was active in the Syndicalists and today sits in Parliament as a representative of the Left Party. He seems to have been given the left-wing stamp primarily because, as a financial journalist, he specializes in investigative reporting about corruption and shady transactions in the corporate world. He has done some devastating individual portraits of captains of industry and politicians, which were most likely well-deserved, and caused a number of resignations and legal repercussions. The most well-known was the Arbogast affair, which resulted in the forced resignation of a conservative politician and the sentencing of a former counselor to a year in prison for embezzlement. Calling attention to crimes can hardly be considered an indication that someone is left-wing. I understand what you mean. What else? He has written 2 books, one about the Arbogast affair and one about financial journalism entitled The Knights Templar, which came out 3 years ago. I haven't read the book, but judging from the reviews, it seems to have been controversial. It prompted a good deal of debate in the media. Money, Frode said. He's not rich, but he's not starving. Income tax returns are attached to the report. He has about 250,000 SEK in the bank, in both a retirement fund and a savings account. He has an account of around 100,000 kroner that he uses as cash for working expenses, travel and such. He owns a co-op apartment that's paid off, 700 square feet on Bellmansgatan, and he has no loans or debts. He has one other asset, some property in Sandholm out in the archipelago. It's a cottage of 270 square feet, furnished as a summer cabin and by the water right in the most attractive part of the village. Apparently an uncle of his bought it in the 40s when such things were still possible for normal mortals, and the cabin ended up in Blomqvist's hands. They divided things up so that his sister got the parents' apartment in Lilla Essingen and Blomqvist got the cabin. I have no idea what it might be worth today, certainly a few million, but on the other hand, he doesn't seem to want to sell, and he goes out to Sandhamn fairly often. Income? He's part owner of Millennium, but he only takes out about 12,000 in salary each month. The rest he earns from his freelance jobs. The total varies. He had a big year 3 years ago when he took in around 450,000. Last year, he only made 120,000 from freelance jobs. He has to pay 150,000 in taxes in addition to lawyers' fees, etc., Frode said. Let's assume that the total is rather high. He'll also be losing money while serving his jail term. Which means that he's going to be cleaned out, Solander said. Is he honest? That's his trust capital, so to speak. His image is to appear as the guardian of robust morality as opposed to the business world. And he is invited pretty regularly to pontificate on television. There probably isn't much left of that capital after his conviction today, Frode said. I don't want to claim that I know exactly what demands are made on a journalist. But after this setback, it will probably be a long time before Master Detective Blomqvist wins the grand prize for journalism. He's really made a fool of himself this time, Solander said. If I may make a personal comment, Armansky opened his eyes wide. In the years Solander had worked for him, she had never made a single personal comment in an investigation of an individual. Bone-dry facts were all that mattered to her. It wasn't part of my assignment to look at the question of fact in the Wennerstrom affair, but I did follow the trial and have to admit that I was actually flabbergasted. The thing felt wrong, and it's totally out of character for Mikael Blomqvist to publish something that seems to be so off the wall. Solander scratched her neck. Frode looked patient. Armansky wondered whether he might be mistaken or whether Solander really was unsure how to continue. The Solander he knew was never unsure or hesitant. Finally, she seemed to make up her mind. Quite off the record, so to speak. I haven't studied the Wennerstrom affair properly, but I really think that Mikael Blomqvist was set up. I think there's something totally different in this story than what the court's verdict is indicating. The lawyer scrutinized Solander with searching eyes, and Armansky noticed that for the first time since she began her report, the client was showing more than a polite interest. He made a mental note that the Wennerstrom affair held a certain interest for Frode. Correction, Armansky thought at once. Frode was not interested in the Wennerstrom affair. It was when Solander hinted that Blomqvist was set up that Frode reacted. How do you mean exactly? Frode said. It's speculation on my part, but I'm convinced that someone tricked him. And what makes you think so? Everything in Blomqvist's background shows that he's a very careful reporter. Every controversial revelation he published before was always well documented. I went to court one day and listened. He seemed to have given up without a fight. That doesn't accord with his character at all. If we are to believe the court, he made up a story about Wennerstrom without a shred of evidence and published it like some sort of a journalistic suicide bomber. That's simply not Blomqvist's style. So what do you think happened? I can only guess. Blomqvist believed in his story, but something happened along the way, and the information turned out to be false. This in turn means that the source was someone he trusted, or that someone deliberately fed him false information, which sounds improbably complicated. The alternative is that he was subjected to such a serious threat that he threw in the towel and would rather be seen as an incompetent idiot than fight back. But I'm just speculating, as I said. When Solander made an attempt to continue her account, Frode held up his hand. He sat for a moment, drumming his fingers on the armrest of his chair, before he hesitantly turned to her again. If we should decide to engage you to unravel the truth in the Wennerstrom affair, how much chance is there that you'd find out anything? I can't answer that. There may not be anything to find. But would you be willing to make an attempt? She shrugged. It's not my place to decide. I work for Herr Armansky, and he decides what jobs he wants to assign to me. And then it depends what sort of information you're looking for. Let me put it this way, and I take it that we're speaking in confidence? Armansky nodded. I don't know anything about this particular matter, but I do know beyond any doubt that in other situations Wennerstrom has acted dishonestly. The Wennerstrom case has seriously affected Mikael Blomqvist's life, and I have an interest in discerning whether there's anything in your speculations. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, and Armansky was instantly on the alert. What Frode was asking was for Milton's security to poke around in a case that had already been concluded, a case in which there may have been some sort of threat to the man Blomqvist, and if they took this on, Milton would risk colliding with Wennerstrom's regiment of lawyers. Armansky was not in the least comforted by the thought of turning Solander loose in such a situation, like a cruise missile out of control. It was not merely a matter of concern for the company. Solander had made plain that she did not want Armansky to act as some sort of worried stepfather, and since their agreement, he had been careful never to behave like one. But in reality, he would never stop worrying about her. He sometimes caught himself comparing Solander to his daughters. He considered himself a good father who did not interfere unnecessarily in their lives. But he knew that he would not tolerate it if his daughters behaved like Solander or lived the life she led. In the depths of his Croatian, or possibly Bosnian or Armenian, heart, he had never been able to shed the conviction that Solander's life was heading for disaster. She seemed the perfect victim for anyone who wished her ill, and he dreaded the morning he would be awakened by the news that someone had done her harm. An investigation of this kind could get expensive, Armansky said, issuing a warning so as to gauge the seriousness of Freud's inquiry. Then we'll set a ceiling, Freud said. I don't demand the impossible, but it's obvious that your colleague, just as you assured me, is exceedingly competent. Solander, Armansky said, turning to her with a raised eyebrow. I'm not working on anything else right now. Okay, but I want us to be in agreement about the constraints of the job. Let's hear the rest of your report. There isn't much more apart from his private life. In 1986, he married Monica Abrahamson, and the same year they had a daughter, Pernilla. The marriage didn't last. They were divorced in 1991. Abrahamson has remarried, but they seem to be friends still. The daughter lives with her mother and doesn't see Blomqvist often. Freud asked for more coffee and then turned to Solander. You said that everyone has secrets. Did you find any? I meant that all people have things they consider to be private and that they don't go around airing in public. Blomqvist is obviously a big hit with women. He's had several love affairs and a great many casual flings. But one person has kept turning up in his life over the years, and it's an unusual relationship. In what way? Erika Berger, editor-in-chief of Millennium, upper-class girl, Swedish mother, Belgian father resident in Sweden. Berger and Blomqvist met in journalism school and have had an on-and-off relationship ever since. That may not be so unusual, Freud said. No, possibly not. But Berger happens to be married to the artist Gregor Beckman, a minor celebrity who has done a lot of terrible things in public venues. So she's unfaithful. Beckman knows about their relationship. It's a situation apparently accepted by all parties concerned. Sometimes she sleeps at Blomqvist's and sometimes at home. I don't know exactly how it works, but it was probably a contributing factor to the breakup of Blomqvist's marriage to Abrahamson. Chapter 3. Friday, December 20th. Saturday, December 21st. Erika Berger looked up quizzically when an apparently freezing Blomqvist came into the editorial office. Millennium's offices were in the center of the trendy section of Gutgatten, above the offices of Greenpeace. The rent was actually a bit too steep for the magazine, but they had all agreed to keep the space. She glanced at the clock. It was 5:10, and darkness had fallen over Stockholm long before. She had been expecting him around lunchtime. I'm sorry, he said before she managed to say anything, but I was feeling the weight of the verdict and didn't feel like talking. I went for a long walk to think things over. I heard the verdict on the radio. She from TV4 called and wanted a comment. What did you say? Something to the effect that we were going to read the judgment carefully before we make any statements. So I said nothing, and my opinion still holds. It's the wrong strategy. We come off looking weak with the media. They will run something on TV this evening? Blomqvist looked glum. How are you doing? Blomqvist shrugged and plopped down in his favorite armchair next to the window in Erika's office. The decor was Spartan, with a desk and functional bookcases and cheap office furniture. All of it was from IKEA, apart from the two comfortable and extravagant armchairs and a small end table. A concession to my upbringing, she liked to say. She would sit reading in one of the armchairs with her feet tucked underneath her when she wanted to get away from the desk. Blomqvist looked down on Gutgatten, where people were hurrying by in the dark. Christmas shopping was in full swing. I suppose it'll pass, he said, but right now it feels as if I've got myself a very raw deal. Yes, I can imagine. It's the same for all of us. Janne Dahlman went home early today. I assume he wasn't over the moon about the verdict. He's not the most positive person anyway. Mikhail shook his head. For the past 9 months, Dahlman had been managing editor. He had started there just as the Wennerstrom affair got going, and he found himself on an editorial staff in crisis mode. Blomqvist tried to remember what their reasoning had been when he and Berger decided to hire him. He was competent, of course, and had worked at the TT News Bureau, the evening papers, and Echo on the radio. But he apparently did not like sailing against the wind. During the past year, Blomqvist had often regretted that they had hired Dahlman, who had an enervating habit of looking at everything in as negative a light as possible. "Have you heard from Christer?" Blomqvist asked without taking his eyes off the street. Christer Malm was the art director and designer of Millennium. He was also part owner of the magazine together with Berger and Blomqvist, but he was on a trip abroad with his boyfriend. "He called to say hello. He'll have to be the one who takes over as publisher." "Lay off, Mecca. As publisher, you have to count on being punched in the nose every so often. It's part of the job description." "You're right about that. But I was the one who wrote the article that was published in a magazine of which I also happened to be the publisher. That makes everything look different all of a sudden. Then it's a matter of bad judgment." Berger felt that the disquiet she had been carrying with her all day was about to explode. In the weeks before the trial started, Blomqvist had been walking around under a black cloud, but she had never seen him as gloomy and dejected as he seemed to be now in the hour of his defeat. She walked to his side of the desk and sat on his lap, straddling him, and put her arms round his neck. "Mikhail, listen to me. We both know exactly how it happened. I'm as much to blame as you are. We simply have to ride out the storm. There isn't any storm to ride out. As far as the media are concerned, the verdict means that I've been shot in the back of the head. I can't stay on as the publisher of Millennium. The vital thing is to maintain the magazine's credibility, to stop the bleeding. You know that as well as I do. If you think I intend to let you take the rap all by yourself, then you haven't learned a damn thing about me in the years we've worked together. I know how you operate, Ricky. You're 100% loyal to your colleagues. If you had to choose, you'd keep fighting against Wennerstrom's lawyers until your credibility was gone too. We have to be smarter than that. And you think it's smart to jump ship and make it look as if I sacked you? If Millennium is going to survive, it depends on you now. Christer is great, but he's just a nice guy who knows about images and layout and doesn't have a clue about street fighting with billionaires. It's just not his thing. I'm going to have to disappear for a while as publisher, reporter, and board member. Wennerstrom knows that I know what he did, and I'm absolutely sure that as long as I'm anywhere near Millennium, he's going to try to ruin us. So why not publish everything we know? Sink or swim? Because we can't prove a damn thing, and right now I have no credibility at all. Let's accept that Wennerstrom won this round. Okay, I'll fire you. What are you going to do? I need a break, to be honest. I'm burned right out. I'm going to take some time for myself for a while. Some of it in prison. Then we'll see. Berger put her arms around him and pulled his head down to her breasts. She hugged him hard. "Want some company tonight?" she said. Blomqvist nodded. "Good. I've already told Gregor I'm at your place tonight." The street lights reflecting off the corners of the windows were all that lit the room. When Berger fell asleep sometime after shoot in the morning, Blomqvist lay awake, studying her profile in the dimness. The covers were down around her waist, and he watched her breasts slowly rising and falling. He was relaxed, and the anxious knot in his stomach had eased. She had that effect on him. She always had, and he knew that he had the same effect on her. 20 years, he thought. That's how long it had been. As far as he was concerned, they could go on sleeping together for another 2 decades. At least. They had never seriously tried to hide their relationship, even when it led to awkwardness in their dealings with other people. They had met at a party when they were both in their second year at journalism school. Before they said goodnight, they had exchanged telephone numbers. They both knew that they would end up in bed together, and in less than a week they realized this conviction without telling their respective partners. Blomqvist was sure that it was not the old-fashioned kind of love that leads to a shared home, a shared mortgage, Christmas trees, and children. During the 80s, when they were not bound by other relationships, they had talked of moving in together. He had wanted to, but Erica always backed out at the last minute. "It wouldn't work," she said. they would risk what they had if they fell in love too. Blomqvist had often wondered whether it were possible to be more possessed by desire for any other woman. The fact was that they functioned well together, and they had a connection as addictive as heroin. Sometimes they were together so often that it felt as though they really were a couple. Sometimes weeks and months would go by before they saw each other. But even as alcoholics are drawn to the state liquor store after a stint on the wagon, they always came back to each other. Inevitably, it did not work in the long run. That kind of relationship was almost bound to cause pain. They had both left broken promises and unhappy lovers behind. His own marriage had collapsed because he could not stay away from Erica Berger. He had never lied about his feelings for her to his wife, Monica, but she had thought it would end when they married and their daughter was born. And Berger had almost simultaneously married Gregor Beckman. Blomqvist too had thought it would end, and for the first years of his marriage, he and Berger had only seen each other professionally. Then they started Millennium, and within a few weeks, all their good intentions had dissolved. And one late evening, they had furious sex on her desk. That led to a troublesome period in which Blomqvist wanted very much to live with his family and see his daughter grow up. But at the same time, he was helplessly drawn to Berger. Just as Solander had guessed, it was his continual infidelity that drove his wife to leave. Strangely enough, Beckman seemed to accept their relationship. Berger had always been open about her feelings for Mikhail, and she told her husband as soon as they started having sex again. Maybe it took the soul of an artist to handle such a situation, someone so wrapped up in his own creativity, or possibly just wrapped up in himself, that he did not rebel when his wife slept with another man. She even divided up her holiday so she could spend 2 weeks with her lover in his summer cabin at Sandholm. Blomqvist did not think very highly of Beckman, and he had never understood Berger's love for him. But he was glad that he accepted that she could love 2 men at the same time. Blomqvist could not sleep, and at 4 Warin he gave up. He went to the kitchen and read the court judgment one more time from beginning to end. Having the document in his hand, he had a sense that there had been something almost fateful about the meeting at Arholma. He could never be sure whether Lindberg had told him the details of Wennerström's swindle simply for the sake of a good story between toasts in the privacy of his boat's cabin, or whether he had really wanted the story to be made public. He tended to believe the first, but it may have been that Lindberg, for his own personal or business reasons, had wanted to damage Wennerström, and he had seized the opportunity of having a captive journalist on board. Lindberg had been sober enough to insist on Blomqvist treating him as an anonymous source. From that moment, Lindberg could say what he liked, because his friend would never be able to disclose his source. If the meeting at Arholma had been a setup, then Lindberg could not have played his role better. But the meeting had to have happened by chance. Lindberg could have had no notion of the extent of Blomqvist's contempt for people like Wennerström. For all that, after years of study, he was privately convinced that there was not a single bank director or celebrity corporate executive who wasn't also a cretin. Blomqvist had never heard of Lisbeth Salander and was happily innocent of her report delivered earlier that day. But had he listened to it, he would have nodded in agreement when she spoke of his loathing for bean counters, saying that it was not a manifestation of his left-wing political radicalism. Mikhail was not uninterested in politics, but he was extremely skeptical of political isms. He had voted only once in a parliamentary election in 1982, and then he had hesitantly plumped for the Social Democrats, there being nothing in his imagination worse than 3 years more with Gösta Bohman as finance minister and Thorbjörn Fälldin, or possibly Ola Ullsten, as prime minister. So he had voted for Olof Palme and got instead the assassination of his prime minister, plus the Bofors scandal and Ebbe Carlsson. His contempt for his fellow financial journalists was based on something that in his opinion was as plain as morality. The equation was simple. A bank director who blows millions on foolhardy speculations should not keep his job. A managing director who plays shell company games should do time. A slum landlord who forces young people to pay through the nose and under the table for a one-room apartment with shared toilets should be hung out to dry. The job of the financial journalist was to examine the sharks who created interest crises and speculated away the savings of small investors, to scrutinize company boards with the same merciless zeal with which political reporters pursue the tiniest steps out of line of ministers and members of parliament. He could not for the life of him understand why so many influential financial reporters treated mediocre financial whelps like rock stars. These recalcitrant views had time after time brought him into conflict with his peers. Borg, for one, was going to be an enemy for life. His taking on a role of social critic had actually transformed him into a prickly guest on TV sofas. He was always the one invited to comment whenever any CEO was caught with a golden parachute worth billions. Mikhail had no trouble imagining that champagne bottles had been uncorked in some newspaper's back rooms that evening. Erica had the same attitude to the journalist's role as he did. Even when they were in journalism school, they had amused themselves by imagining a magazine with just such a mission statement. Erica was the best boss Mikhail could imagine. She was an organizer who could handle employees with warmth and trust, but who at the same time wasn't afraid of confrontation and could be very tough when necessary. Above all, she had an icy gut feeling when it came to making decisions about the contents of the upcoming issue. She and Mikhail often had differing views and could have healthy arguments, but they also had unwavering confidence in each other, and together they made an unbeatable team. He did the fieldwork of tracking down the story while she packaged and marketed it. Millennium was their mutual creation, but it would never have become reality without her talent for digging up financing. It was. The working-class guy and the upper-class girl in a beautiful union. Erica came from old money. She had put up the initial seed money and then talked both her father and various acquaintances into investing considerable sums in the project. Mikhail had often wondered why Erica had set her sights on Millennium. True, she was a part owner, the majority partner in fact, and editor-in-chief of her own magazine, which gave her prestige and the control over publicity that she could hardly have obtained in any other job. Unlike Mikhail, she had concentrated on television after journalism school. She was tough, looked fantastic on camera, and could hold her own with the competition. She also had good contacts in the bureaucracy. If she had stuck to it, she would undoubtedly have had a managerial job at one of the TV channels at a considerably higher salary than she paid herself now. Berger had also convinced Christer Malm to buy into the magazine. He was an exhibitionist gay celebrity who sometimes appeared with his boyfriend in At Home with articles. The interest in him began when he moved in with Arnold Magnuson, an actor with a background at the Royal Dramatic Theatre, who had made a serious breakthrough when he played himself in a docusoap. Christer and Arn had then become a media item. At 36, Malm was a sought-after professional photographer and designer who gave Millennium a modern look. He ran his business from an office on the same floor as Millennium, and he did graphic design 1 week in every month. The Millennium staff consisted of 3 full-time employees, a full-time trainee, and 2 part-timers. It was not a lucrative affair, but the magazine broke even, and the circulation and advertising revenue had increased gradually but steadily. Until today, the magazine was known for its frank and reliable editorial style. Now the situation would in all probability be changing. Blomqvist read through the press release which he and Berger had drafted, and which had quickly been converted to a wire service story from TT that was already up on Aftonbladet's website. Convicted reporter leaves Millennium, Stockholm, TT. Journalist Mikael Blomqvist is leaving his post as publisher of the magazine Millennium, reports editor-in-chief and majority shareholder Erica Berger. Blomqvist is leaving Millennium of his own choice. He's exhausted after the drama of recent months and needs time off, says Berger, who will take over the role of publisher. Blomqvist was one of the founders of Millennium, started in 1990. Berger does not think that the magazine will suffer in the wake of the so-called Wennerström affair. The magazine will come out as usual next month, says Berger. Mikael Blomqvist has played a major role in the magazine's development, but now we're turning a new page. Berger states that she regards the Wennerström affair as the result of a series of unfortunate circumstances. She regrets the nuisance to which Hans-Erik Wennerström was subjected. Blomqvist could not be reached for comment. "It makes me mad," Berger said when the press release was emailed out. "Most people are going to think that you're an idiot and I'm a bitch who's taking the opportunity to sack you. At least our friends will have something new to laugh about." Blomqvist tried to make light of it. She was not the least amused. "I don't have a plan B, but I think we're making a mistake," she said. "It's the only way out. If the magazine collapses, all our years of work will have been in vain. We've already taken a beating on the ads revenue. How did it go with the computer company, by the way? She sighed. They told me this morning that they didn't want to take space in the next issue. Wennerstrom has a chunk of stock in that company, so it's no accident. We can scare up some new clients. Wennerstrom may be a big wheel, but he doesn't own everything in Sweden, and we have our contacts. Blomqvist put an arm around her and pulled her close. Someday we're going to nail Herr Wennerstrom so hard Wall Street is going to jump out of its socks. But today, Millennium has to get out of the spotlight. I know all that, but I don't like coming across as a fucking bitch, and you're being forced into a disgusting situation if we pretend that there's some sort of division between you and me. Ricky, as long as you and I trust each other, we've got a chance. We have to play it by ear, and right now it's time to retreat. She reluctantly admitted that there was a depressing logic to what he said.